This morning, I stepped into the expanse of rice fields that were still wet with dew. The air felt fresh, the wind blew softly, carrying the distinctive aroma of damp rice fields. In the distance, the sound of crickets and small birds responded to each other, creating a calming natural harmony. I came here with one goal: to find snails for my duck feed. Rice snails are indeed a good source of protein for ducks, making them grow healthier and lay more eggs. Carrying a bucket and a small net, I began to walk to the edge of the rice field filled with water. My eyes scanned the surface of the water and mud. It didn't take long for me to see blackish-brown snail shells piled up between the weeds. I crouched down, dipped my hands into the cold water, and lifted several snails at once. My bucket slowly began to fill. Every few steps, I bent down again, carefully digging through the mud. Sometimes, I found a lot of snails in one place, sometimes only one or two hidden behind floating leaves. Every now and then, I stopped for a moment, observing the surroundings. The yellowing rice fields swayed gently in the wind, adding to the beauty of this morning. Every time I bent down and touched the water, I found various types of snails. However, the most striking today was the golden snail. Its shell was golden yellow, glistening when hit by the sunlight. They looked so contrasting with the brownish mud of the rice fields. I smiled happily, because these golden snails could also be nutritious food for my ducks. I started collecting the snails one by one, dipping my hand into the water and feeling their slippery shells on my palms. Some were small, some were big and fat. These golden snails often reproduce quickly in the rice fields, and are sometimes even considered pests by farmers. However, for me, they are an abundant blessing, a source of natural protein that can make my livestock healthier. As I continued my search, I noticed how many golden snails were scattered among the stalks of weeds. Some were attached to the base of the stalks, others were floating on the surface of the water or hiding in the mud. I became more and more enthusiastic about collecting them, imagining how happy my ducks would be when they were given their favorite food. After some time, my bucket was almost full. I stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat off my forehead while enjoying the scenery around me. The yellowing rice fields swayed gently in the wind, the sound of trickling water in a small ditch sounded soothing, and small birds flew overhead. This atmosphere made me even more grateful for the results I got today. This time it was not the usual rice field used by farmers to plant rice. The rice field I visited had long been abandoned. There were no longer any rice stalks standing upright, only puddles of water filled with wild grass and aquatic plants growing without rules. No farmer would worry about my presence here, no plants could be damaged by my steps. I could search for snails more freely. Dew still hung on the tips of the leaves, and the scent of wet soil mixed with the fresh morning air. With my bare hands I was ready to collect as many snails as possible. Here and there tracing the calm surface of the water, my eyes were sharp looking for the sparkle of snail shells hidden behind the mud. Their brownish shells stood out against the floating aquatic plants. I dug my hands into the mud, lifted a few snails at a time, and put them in a bucket. I kept walking, exploring deeper parts of the rice field, and I found more and more snails. In fact, in some places, these snails were clustered in large numbers, attached to the roots of aquatic plants or partially submerged in the mud. Here in the abandoned rice field, there were quite a few snails, as if this abandoned rice field had become a paradise for them to breed. I smiled happily, because the more snails I got, the more food there was for my ducks. I didn't need to buy expensive feed, because nature had provided abundant nutritious food. As I continued to collect snails, I occasionally stopped and enjoyed the surroundings. Small birds were still chirping, aquatic insects swam here and there, and the wind blew gently, shaking the wild grass that was growing abundantly. Even though this rice field was abandoned, there was still life in it. The air is still fresh, the remains of morning dew are still stuck to the leaves. The sky is bright, with the sun slowly rising, shining on the expanse of green rice fields. The rice fields where I hunt snails are abandoned rice fields that are no longer planted. I don't have to worry about damaging anyone's crops, so I can move more freely. And I continue to collect snails one by one and put them in a bucket. And if later my bucket starts to fill up enough, I will move the snails I brought into the plastic that I have provided. Before I went snail hunting, I had already, working in my rice field, weeds started to grow between the rice stalks, so I pulled them out one by one. Because these weeds can interfere with the growth of the rice if left alone. Occasionally, I also saw traces of snail pests on the rice leaves. These snails were different from the ones I collected for the ducks. They were pests that had to be controlled so that my rice plants would not be damaged. After clearing the weeds and checking the plants, I continued my work by regulating the water flow in the rice field plot. I made sure that the water flowed well, not too much and not too little. Sufficient water is very important for the growth of rice so that the harvest is maximized. Time passed so quickly. The sun was getting higher, and sweat began to pour down my body. I stopped for a moment, wiped my face with my sleeve, then looked around. The green expanse of rice fields swayed gently in the wind. The sound of trickling water from a small ditch sounded soothing, and small birds flew in the blue sky. I smiled with satisfaction. This morning was not only productive for finding snails, but also for taking care of my own rice fields. After making sure all the work was done, I decided to hunt snails for my ducks' feed. After a long time, my bucket was almost full. I stood up, stretched my back that was starting to ache, then looked at my catch with satisfaction. Today, I didn't have to worry about disturbing the farmer's rice fields. I didn't have to be afraid of damaging the rice plants. I could search for snails freely, and the results were more than usual. With light steps, I walked away from this rice field, ready to bring home the abundant blessings of nature.